Hello, this is Jerry Riley with Gospel Music Connection. I'd like to welcome you to our broadcast today. We have a very special guest with us, Dr. Margaret Ellis. Doctor, welcome.
Thank you.
She's recently written a book, The Healing Miracles of Jesus, and I'm just so excited to talk to Dr. Ellis about this book. It's just a marvelous book. It's on back order right now. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but it's going to be something I know it's going to bless your heart and show you that Jesus' healing miracles didn't happen just 2,000 years ago. Healing miracles are taking place even today. Dr. Ellis, again, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I'm so glad you're here, and I'm just looking forward to talking to you about this book. But before I do, I want to find out a little bit about Dr. Ellis, where you're from. Are you from Oklahoma originally, Doctor?
Not originally. I was born in West Virginia.
West Virginia. So what brought you to Oklahoma?
Well, I was educated in Texas. I went to the University of Texas medical branch in Galveston and did my residency in Dallas. And then my first professional career, my first professional job as a physician brought me to Oklahoma, and I just stayed.
Just stayed. So you became an Okie.
There you go, yeah.
Well, Dr. Ellis, did you always want to become a physician? Was there anything that inspired you to pursue that as a profession?
Well, my father wanted me to be a physician. There's a picture of me when I'm about 2 years old, sitting on the staircase, and Daddy's medical bag is right beside me. I call that very early imprinting. But no, I wanted to be a ballerina.
Well, you'd have been a good ballerina also.
Well, thank you.
So your dad was a physician.
Yes.
Did he mentor you any as you were growing up that maybe kind of imprinted you toward looking more and more toward that profession?
Well, Daddy worked as a general practitioner for probably about 12 years over the hills of West Virginia and had wonderful stories that I grew up with. But then when I was about 5 years old, he moved to Houston with the rest of the family and began his residency training in pathology. And during his training, I was very much Daddy's little girl. So when he would get home, I'd have to go back with him to the bedroom to study. And I asked him in later years, I said, how on earth did you put up with a 5-year-old child? And he said, you didn't last very long. Oh, but he must have had a lot of patience, because when I went through medical school, I can't imagine having a 5-year-old wanting my time as well. But Daddy would take me to the hospital and show me things through the microscope, and that was very interesting. And I especially enjoyed the time with my father.
Well, let's look back. You're with your father at the laboratory looking in the microscope. Did you ever see anything that was rather interesting when you're looking through the microscope?
Well, I'm sure Daddy pointed out all kinds of things to me. But what I really remember is that I reasoned that the blood cells traveled through blood vessels. My mother's favorite expression when she was frustrated was that she was going to jump out of her skin. Well, I lived in fear that I was going to find her one day sitting without her skin on. And I reasoned that because the blood travels through the vessels, that she wouldn't bleed to death, and when she was ready, she'd get back in her skin.
So you used some reason.
Well, apparently, because I figured that one out.
Well, would you say that the practice of medicine involves reason?
It involves reason, but also art, because you're dealing with real people and real lives. They have a life, and so many people think that it's just strictly what we learn in books and how we're trained by our mentors in residency, etc. But I've discovered it's much, much more.
Now, you were an internist, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so you went to University of Texas in Galveston. You then went into your residency.
Yes.
What then inspired you to get into internal medicine?
So in the third year of medical school, you'd rotate through each of the main specialties. So you did 3 months in internal medicine, you would do a month in cardiology, a couple of months in gynecology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So after my first rotation, I called up my father. I have found my niche. I am going to be an internist. And Daddy would listen to me, and I would go through my next rotation. I'd call Daddy. I'm going to be a gynecologist, or whatever was the most recent thing I had studied. So the last thing that I studied was psychiatry. I called up my dad and I said, I'm going to be a psychiatrist. At which point Dad kind of put his foot down. Margaret, please, no. He did not think I was suited to be a psychiatrist. I'm sure he's right. I'm thankful that there are wonderful psychiatrists out there, but I would not have been one. But I decided that since I had liked everything so much, that what I needed to do was internal medicine, because truly we deal with it all. You know, 1 minute you'll be seeing a cardiac patient, the next minute you'll be seeing a diabetic patient, the next minute you'll be seeing an infection. You just never know what you're going to have when you go through that door.
So it's always changing.
Yes, yes.
So when you go into a specialty like a heart doctor, do they go through a similar protocol, going through a residency and maybe internal medicine before they become a heart doctor or whatever?
Yes. Yes, so typically they probably have 6 years of postgraduate training.
Well, I'm going to go back to your father, and then we'll get into your book. You know, the thing that I gleaned from your what you just said was your father spent a lot of time with you. He took you to the laboratory and mentored you. And I wonder sometimes, Doctor, if parents don't spend enough time with their children, mentoring them, giving them some direction to where now the child is growing up in a family that is mentoring them, spending some time with them as your father did with you. And through that, it really imprinted you to the point that you wanted to become a doctor and follow in his footsteps.
Well, I don't know that I really wanted to follow in his footsteps. I was the fourth in line, but I was the first girl. And I wasn't so much that I wanted to be like Dad. It was really much more that I felt called to be a physician. Dad was thrilled, but it was still...
It wasn't something he forced on you. It was something you wanted to do. It
was something I felt God called me to do.
And that kind of leads into your book, The Healing Miracles of Jesus. And I want to talk about that. What inspired you, Dr. Ellis, to write this book?
Well, I had been exceedingly interested in the healing miracles of Jesus as a medical student, and I had wonderful opportunity to study with in the humanities department of the medical school, and I studied with a PhD theologian during that 1 month. And I did write a paper, although I didn't utilize that paper in the development of this book. But that's when my interest in this started, because I really wanted to know, why could I not just go into the hospital and pray for these patients? You know, Jesus told us that we were going to do greater things, right? And anyway, I decided obviously I couldn't do that. I didn't know why, but I persisted down the medical school training path. And what specifically inspired me to do this was when Glen had his near-death experience. We got home and all was well, and I believed with all of my heart he had been healed miraculously. And I felt nudged by the Holy Spirit to review the healing miracles of Jesus that are recorded in the Gospels. Now, there are 27 of them that are recorded. We know that Jesus did many more, right? Because the Gospels tell us that he did. But there was only so much room to write them down, and so they wrote down 27 under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. So I examined each one of those miracles, and I looked at, was there anything in my own practice that I could relate? For example, you take the healing of the nobleman's son. The nobleman, he lived, maybe 16 miles away from where Jesus was. And Jesus simply spoke the word, and the son was healed. Do we do anything today to heal by distance? Certainly not miraculously like Jesus did, but we do offer up advice by distance with our means of communication. We have telephones, and so patients will call us and we'll give recommendations or refer them to the emergency room, etc. One time, and I relate this in the book, I had a wife of a patient call me absolutely frantic, terrified. Her husband had collapsed. And I stayed on the phone with her, gave her the instructions, put sugar under his tongue, call the ambulance, let's check his blood sugar, etc. Well, by the time the ambulance got there, she had already given him sugar and he was starting to come around. His blood sugar was only 45. Well, hypoglycemia, a blood sugar that is too low, is life-threatening, and if that is not corrected, a person could die from that. So it wasn't that I did anything that was miraculous like what Jesus does, but I assisted to heal long distance.
Well, Dr. Ellis, we talk a lot about Jesus has a purpose for all of us, and Jesus gives us talents. And I would say without question that your purpose was to heal and your talent is to heal. So even though it was done long distance, it was through your talents and through your purpose that Jesus had given you that you were able to communicate with this lady over the phone and help heal her husband. That
Yes.
Had she not had that communication with you, could have been totally different.
He could have very well have died.
Could have very well died. Now, in your book, I know you have several chapters about Jesus' healing. Tell us a little bit about the structure of this book.
Each chapter is one of the healing miracles. And I try to analyze the healing miracle from a spiritual perspective, and I try to analyze it from a medical perspective. Like, for example, the healing of the lepers. Well, what is leprosy? And do we have it today? And is it as scary? I mean, back in biblical times, the prophets taught that the Messiah was going to heal leprosy. Other than that, leprosy was really a death sentence. These people had to live outside of the camp. They were ostracized. They had a horrible, horrible disease that could not be managed other than miraculously. Today, leprosy still exists, probably mainly in places like Asia, but in any event, it's very treatable. And when you see it here in the United States, very, very rare, we're able to treat it.
So it's something treatable, but it wasn't back in Jesus' time.
No, unless it was miraculous.
Now, going back to your husband Glen's experience, and you talk about a miraculous healing. Tell us a little bit about what happened that morning, and we'll bring Glen on in just a moment. We'll talk to him too and get his perspective on this. But let's talk a little bit about that actual time that in my opinion, maybe spurred the idea of writing this book, that put you into the process of writing down your ideas, and the ideas turned into a book. Tell us a little bit about what happened that morning and what the end result was that then gave you the perception or the knowledge that it had to be a divine intervention.
Right. Well, so Glen woke me up. He had been having severe pain for a couple of hours now, and I don't know if it's simpler to go through an experience like this when you have all of this medical knowledge, or if that makes it more difficult. But at that point, I was operating not only as his wife, but I was operating as a physician. I was reviewing what's the differential diagnosis here. What do I need to do? I need to call the ambulance for one thing, which I did. And it was a very frantic time. And I'm so thankful for the medic who immediately came in, knelt on one knee down beside Glen. Glen had passed out at this point with the pain, cut off his T-shirt and had the EKG monitor hooked up. The EKG came away completely normal. And this medic says to me, I think we should call the helicopter. Well, my mind's going a mile a minute. I'm thinking, why would we call the helicopter if the EKG is normal? This must be something else, but this has all the symptoms. This is just going through all of these things. And a voice that didn't even sound like my own voice to me, it just came out and it said, yes, please do so. I agree. And so we called the helicopter, and before we had left the driveway, the EKG had changed. And there was now indication that an acute heart attack was going on. And I reached my arms into that ambulance and I prayed out loud. I'd been praying all of this time. We got to the helicopter pad. I reached my hands in again and I prayed. I just continued to pray. I called our prayer warrior friends en route, and it was early in the morning, and they all agreed to get up and to pray. And unknown to me, Glen was praying in the helicopter. And the emergency room called me while I was en route because I had to drive. They wouldn't let me on the helicopter with him. And they said, Margaret, he's in third-degree block. Well, I knew what that meant. And I was praying, God heal him, God heal him, because third-degree block is near death. And they got him into the cath lab, and his cardiac enzymes bumped significantly, meaning that he had lost cardiac cells. So it was as though he was going to have a scar on his heart. Well, a heart that's scarred doesn't function normally, right? In today's world, we have medication. We can give medication to increase its ejection fraction, to reduce the afterload, to do all kinds of things to help a heart that is not doing well to do better. Well, the next day, after Glen was perfectly stable and had no symptoms of anything being the matter, they came in and did the echocardiogram, which is to measure that ejection fraction. It was completely normal. And so then the cardiologist comes in to discharge us that evening, and he's standing at his computer, right? And he's looking at it, and he's just as frustrated as he can be. And he says, I don't even know what I can call this. And I said, it's a miracle. Well, he chose not to address me, but I know in my entire medical career, I've seen miracles, few and far between, but I've seen them, and this was definitely a miracle.
Well, there's no doubt that it was a miracle, and I think two things that I take away from that, Dr. Ellis, is the fact that you prayed, and number two, I'm sure the faith. Glen was praying. How would you address someone that has had a different result? That's prayed, they've called their prayer warriors, and they've prayed, and they have the faith, but yet they don't get the same results. How would you address those people that may have those questions?
Yeah. Well, it's one of the things I had to address in the book. Number one, does miraculous healing occur today? And I concluded yes. Jesus is with us always. That's what his word says. It was a very erroneous teaching that suggested that if you prayed and you didn't get well or your loved one wasn't healed, then you must not have had enough faith. And that's just wrong. God is still sovereign. God has a plan and a purpose. It is appointed unto man once to die. So if that time has come in your life when you're going to go back to the Father, then God says, I'm so thankful that you're coming to me. I love my children to come to me in prayer, but I have a bigger plan and a bigger purpose, and He is sovereign. So I will say this. I believe with all of my heart that we are always healed. By His stripes we are healed. It may not be here on earth, but I promise you in heaven, in our glorified body, that we are perfectly and totally healthy.
So God heals in two ways. He heals us physically here on earth, and He heals us by taking us home.
Well, and I feel that that physical healing may be much more even than physical healing, because when you examine some of these miracles, you discover that He not only has healed the person physically, the physical manifestations of the illness is gone, but all of a sudden He's also healed them spiritually. They have become believers in Him as Jesus Christ Messiah. They are healed potentially financially, like, for example, the widow of Nain. She had lost her husband already and was getting ready to lose her only son. In fact, he was already dead. And Jesus traveled specifically to Nain, out of His way, right exactly at the time that that young boy was going to be buried, and He resurrected that boy. Not because that boy had faith. He was dead. The widow needed help. She could have faced financial devastation, not to mention emotional devastation at the loss of her family. And as a woman in that culture, what was she going to do?
In your experiences as a physician, you worked in a hospital in Bella Vista, I believe.
Yes, I did.
In your experiences as a physician in Bella Vista, have you personally or have you heard of a situation where somebody would be, and I may not use the right word, clinically dead, that miraculously are not, they're brought back?
So I had an experience in my residency training. I was assigned this young adult female patient in the ICU, and she was in a coma. And I would go in every day, and I would put my fingers in her very lifeless hand, and I would say, "Squeeze me." And of course, she wouldn't, until one day, and her fingers just imperceptibly twitched. I was so excited. I ran out of that room, and I ran to get my supervising resident, and I said, "She moved. I believe she responded to me." And boy, that resident just laughed. "Oh, you are so stupid." But I knew what I had seen. And a couple of days later, that girl woke up, and she walked out of that hospital.
Wow.
Yeah, that God allowed me to be a witness to that miracle.
Well, God still conducts miracles.
I believe He does.
2,000
yes.
years later.
Yes.
And Glen is an example of that.
Yes.
Well, with that, let's take just a real short break, and let's bring Glen on, and let's get his perspective on that morning. Well, I'd like to welcome you back, and we're here now with Mr. Glen Ellis, the husband of Dr. Ellis, and she's been telling us about the experience that he went through a few months ago. But before we get into talking about that experience with Mr. Ellis, I want to tell you a little bit about who he is. Glen is a retired minister. He's a singer. He's a songwriter. He's a poet, likes to tell jokes. And Glen still ministers today, not necessarily preaching, but he travels around the country holding concerts at churches. He can be there to help to fill the pulpit on a Sunday morning. He can help lead the worship group. And I know your church would be blessed by Mr. Ellis coming in and performing at your church sometime. Glen, I want to go back and talk about that morning that you experienced your heart attack. And tell us a little bit about what happened and what your experience was that day.
Okay. Well, I was waking about 1:30 with what I thought to be indigestion, heartburn real bad. So I got up and took an antacid and drank milk and drank water and walked around doing what I knew to do to kind of relieve the pressure. And after about an hour and a half of this, not only was it not getting better, I was getting worse. Hurting real bad in my chest, radiating back to my shoulder blade and the back of my neck. And I realized that I wasn't taking care of this myself. Still convinced it was heartburn, but I decided to wake up my doctor wife. If I'd done that first off, I probably wouldn't have been as serious as it was. But woke her up, and we got back to the kitchen, and she saw I was in such pain that she called an ambulance immediately. And but of course, we had prayer immediately, and she was looking for what do you call it? You put it in your tongue?
Nitroglycerin.
Nitroglycerin, and we didn't have any. And so she called the ambulance. They got there, and they began working on me, and did an EKG. It didn't really show anything, but I was still hurting so badly. I finally passed out from what I understand. And when it came to, my T-shirt was ripped off, and which irritated me a little bit that she would take my shirt off while I was unconscious, But they had to do that to hook me up with all the EKG stuff that they did. And then he called the helicopter, looked to my wife, and as she stated earlier about calling in helicopter, and she agreed with that. And we had prayer again, waiting for the helicopter. They put me on their gurney, put me to the ambulance. Margaret stretched her hand in again and had prayer with me. I'm so thankful for a godly wife that knows how to pray and not afraid to pray. Some people would be reluctant to pray out loud or something in front of people. Margaret was very bold, and I really appreciate that. And then we got to the helipad, and they put me in the helicopter, and she prayed for me again. And of course, all this time I'm praying, probably not as earnestly as she was. I really probably didn't appreciate the seriousness of everything until on the helicopter ride to the hospital, the EMT had a real sense of urgency. And they were talking frequently with the hospital, and they were talking back and forth, and she laid a couple of pads on my chest. I thought they were paddles to restart my heart, that I was that close to my heart stopping. And of course, by that time, I'm really getting serious with God, and praying and believing for a miracle. And I'm not ready yet to go in this type of thing here. But I kept passing in and out on the way to the hospital. I remember when we got to the hospital, the whole crew was meeting me there. They transferred me over or no, not at that time, but they got me out of the helicopter. And it's like they were running to the emergency room. I was strapped in, but I was kind of afraid they were going to drop me. I'm not a little guy, and I thought, what are they going to do if they dump me over? But we got in there, and when my son lived in Rogers, Arkansas, where the hospital was, and so he beat my wife there. And I remember seeing him standing next to a nurse or a doctor or someone, and asking, how serious it was. And she said, well, your father's very, very ill. And at that point, I really, Father, just, your perfect will be done, but if I have my way, I'd rather not go right now. Of course, there again, I'm slipping in and out, of consciousness. And then they took me into the cath lab is what they called it, and worked on me, brought me back.
How you feel today?
I feel great.
Well, let me ask you this. How long were you in the hospital? A week, 2 weeks? How long?
Heavens no. We left the next afternoon. There's nothing wrong with my heart. As Margaret attested, when the cardiologist came in, he didn't know what to call it. There was no heart damage. And the third-degree block, as Dr. Ellis has already stated, that's serious. That's permanent. And yet my heart just as strong as it ever was.
So, I just, that's just a great testimony.
Amen.
And I just encourage all of you to go get this book by Dr. Ellis, The Healing Miracles of Jesus. And in this book, she structured it where each chapter is based on a different experience of Jesus' healing in the Bible. It's not what she thinks, it's what the Bible says.
Absolutely.
And so I just encourage you to get this book. You can get it by going to GlenEllisMinistries.com.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'll have to also say this book, 100% of the money that comes in off the sale of this book goes to Glen Ellis Ministries. I mentioned earlier, Glen is a retired minister, but he's still very active with his ministry through song, through his poetry, and through filling pulpits on Sunday mornings or any time during the week, actually. It doesn't have to be Sunday morning. And we all know going up and down the road these days is very expensive. And 100% of the proceeds that come in off of this book go to support that ministry. And I know another thing, Dr. Ellis, you do is you make quilts too, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I do.
And when you sell those quilts, I think the proceeds off of that goes to the Glen Ellis ministry.
Yes, absolutely.
So when you go to this website, you're going to be able to find out more about the Glen Ellis ministry. You can see any upcoming tours that he may be on. You can purchase some CDs. He has some great
Yes.
CDs. There's one that you have out, Glenn, I really like. Just Hold On.
Oh,
And
I
you
wrote
just
that.
and you just hold on. You just
I
held on that
held
day,
on.
didn't you?
I did.
It's a wonder. It's a song. Once you hear it, you'll have it in your mind all day long, which is a great deal. I mean, I really like that song. Just Hold
Thank
On.
you.
So you can find that CD online and purchase the book. Find out more about Glen Ellis Ministry. And I tell you, I just really have enjoyed this time spent with both of you today. It's been very blessing to me. I know it's going to be a blessing for those that are watching. You can also find out more information by going to gospelmusicconnection.com, and we'd love for you to come to that site as well. But Dr. Ellis, thank you so much for the time. You know, writing a book is not for the weary. I mean, it's not only the writing of it, but the spell checking and the commas and the semicolons and the proofreading and going to the publisher. So this was not something that was put together overnight. A lot of research went into the book,
Yes.
a lot of effort in writing the book, and I know that it's going to be a blessing for those that get it and read it. It's on back order, but you can go online and order it, and as soon as they come in, they'll be shipped to you. So it'll be a great Christmas present. So remember looking for this book on GlenEllisMinistry.com. Glenn,
Good.
thank you for your time today.
Good to be here. Thank
Dr.
you,
Ellis,
Jay.
Thank you
you
so
for your
much,
time.
Jerry.
And God bless you, and we hope to see you again real soon. Have a wonderful day.